Croeso, welcome to this very special lockdown version of a Swansea University Cultural Institute Centenary Lecture. This evening with the wonderful poet and educator Raymond Antrobus. And my name is Owen Sheers, and I'm really thrilled that so many of you have been able to join us this evening from wherever you are. I really appreciate that. I hope that you can all see me and that you can hear me, and above all, I hope that you and yours are keeping safe through all of this. I don't think I can remember the last time a debut poet carried away so many prizes. The Sunday Times Young Writers Award, the Rathbones Folio Prize, the Guardian Poetry Book of the Year Award, the Ted Hughes Award. It's an incredibly impressive list, and it certainly speaks to something. But even without all of those prizes and those accolades, I would have asked Raymond to join us this evening to read to us and to talk to us, simply because a year or so ago, I read this, The Perseverance, his first collection, which went on to win all of those accolades. The Perseverance is, I think, for me, one of those collections that comes along every now and then and shifts or knocks at mainstream poetry into new territories and quite often more exciting territories. It's a book that covers a huge amount of ground, moving between the hearing world and the deaf world, between Jamaica and Britain, the poet's voice and voices of others, between illustration and text. And yet, despite all of that breadth and that variety and that sense of being in between things, it's a collection that never fails to feel anything else other than whole. A wonderfully a coherent voice of a book. John Berger once wrote that it was only in great art that the two meanings of original meet. On the one hand, that sense of being close to the origin, the source of an art form. And on the other hand, being in some ways at the other end of that scale, being at the leading edge, being original, unique, one of a kind. And for me, those two meanings of original meet again and again in the poems of The Perseverance, and with great effect, as you're about to hear. Because I think I've probably spoken enough for now. And so for the next 25 minutes or so, I would like Raymond and his poems to do the talking. After that, I'll be having a conversation with him, and then you'll also be able to ask him your questions as well. But for now, I hope you will join me from wherever you are in our strangely isolated yet intimately interconnected world, in welcoming Raymond Antrobus. Over to you, Raymond.
Wow. Thank you, Owen, for a introduction. It's kind of weird because like there's a saying that says you're only as good as your last poem. And I don't think my latest poems have been very good, but I'm trying. I haven't really been able to write much on lockdown. I've been more kind of revising and going over things and worrying about the world. But yeah, no, it's an honor to be here. Thank you so much, Owen. I do appreciate this. I'm glad that you're safe and looking well. And thank you everyone for joining us on this evening. I'm going to read some poems. I hope they comfort. I hope they translate. I hope they spark some kind of conversation with you, because there is a Q&A at the end of this. So I thought I'd begin at the beginning of this book, Perseverance, which I began writing as soon as my dad passed away in 2014, and I realized that I had to go somewhere where I'd never been before in the world, and I ended up in Barcelona, and I went to Gaudi's cathedral. I took the audio guide, and I've got these hearing aids in now, that quite high-powered digital hearing aids, which can also have a Bluetooth, so you can connect them. And so I was able to do that at the Gaudi's cathedral. And when I was there, it told me about the history of different parts of the building. You might remember this if you've done the audio guide. And it says how there's a particular part of the building that's a small kind of rather unorthodox shaped roof, which if you look up and shout or sing into, the way in which sound is experienced in this place is how angels would experience sound. And I was having that experience artificially through hearing aids, through this Bluetooth technology, which I wouldn't have access to otherwise. And I wondered, am I, or we, are deaf people included in this elevation of sound? I'm also the grandson of preachers, and so that also comes into this poem, Echo. My ear amps whistle as if singing to echo, goddess of noise, the raveled knot of tongues, of blaring birds, consonant crumbs, of dull doorbells, sounds swamped in my misty hearing aid tubes. Gaudi believed in holy sound and built a cathedral to contain it, pulling hearing men from their knees as though deafness was a kind of atheism. Who would turn down God? Even though I have not heard the golden decibel of angels, I have been living in a noiseless palace where the doorbell is pulsating light, and I am able to answer. 2. This means what in BSL? What? What? A word that keeps looking in mirrors in love with its own volume. What? I am a one-word question, a one-man patience test. What language would we speak without ears? What? Is paradise a world where I hear everything? What? How will my brain know what to hold if it has too many arms? 3. The day I clear out my dead father's flat, I throw away boxes of molding LPs, Garvey, Malcolm X, Mandela, speeches on vinyl. I find a TDK cassette tape on the shelf. The smudged green label reads Raymond speaking. I play the tape in his vintage cassette player and hear my 2-year-old voice chanting my name, Antrob, and dad's laughter crackling in the background, not knowing I couldn't hear the word bus and wouldn't until I got my hearing aids. Now I sit here listening to the space of deafness. Antrob, Antrob, Antrob. And if you don't catch nothing, then something wrong with your ears. They've been tuned to the wrong frequency. So maybe I belong to the universe underwater, where all songs are smeared wailings for Salacia, goddess of salt water, healer of infected ears, which is what the doctor thought I had, since deafness did not run in the family, but came from nowhere. So they syringed olive oil and salt water, and we all waited to see what would come out. And no one knew what I was missing until a doctor gave me a handful of Lego and said to put a brick on the table every time I heard a sound. After the tests, I still held enough bricks in my hand to build a house and call it my sanctuary, call it the reason I sat in saintly silence during my grandfather's sermons where he preached the good news I only heard as Babylon's babbling echoes. So that's how the book begins. And this next poem I'm going to read, it's interesting thinking about, I guess, like, we think about each poem you write is its own journey, its own kind of species, its own kind of way of moving through the world, right? And it's interesting to me that this poem only exists because of when I was teaching in the school. I was a poet in residence for a few years at a school in Hackney, which is where I grew up and from. And I had these students who had to be removed from their mainstream classes, and they were part of special educational need classes, and I was there assisting them. And I couldn't get them to kind of sit still, but there was something that I realized where if the students saw me like writing or working, as soon as they walked into the class, it would kind of calm them down. It's kind of like, oh, what's going on? And then I would stand up and then I would do a poem. So I wrote a poem specifically for these students every week for a whole term. And it seemed to work. I seemed to get about 20 minutes of focus time in exchange for me delivering a poem for them. And the poem one of the poems I wrote in that time is a poem called Jamaican British. And it came out for 2 reasons. One, because of a poet called Aaron Samuels, whose poem you can watch online. It's called Black Jewish, which is also a kind of broken gazelle form, which this poem also uses. And 2, there's a poem, a gazelle poem by Mimi Calvati, which is on the school curriculum, and we had to do a poetry analysis of that poem. So I wanted to, in preparation for them, to look at The Meanest Flower by Mimi Calvati. I read this poem called Jamaican British after Aaron Samuels. And I suppose it's about that whole idea of how ridiculous it is to be more than one thing, right? So even though you have a passport, you have this paper that tells you belong to this one place, but the idea of duality gets complicated in the idea of citizenship and identity and all this stuff. So anyway, Jamaican British. Some people would deny that I'm Jamaican British. Anglo nose, hair straight, the way I can be Jamaican British. They think I say I'm black when I say I'm Jamaican British, but the English kids at school made me choose Jamaican British. Half caste, half mule, house slave, Jamaican British, light skin, straight, male privilege, Jamaican British. Eat the callaloo, plantain, jerk chicken, I'm Jamaican. British that know how to serve our dishes, they enslaved us. In school, I thought a boy in the lunch hall, Jamaican. At home, I told dad that I hate them, all them Jamaicans. I'm British. He laughed, said, you cannot love sugar, then hate your sweetness. It took me straight to Jamaica, passport British. Cousins in Kingston called me Jar English, proud to have someone in their family British. Plantation lineage, World War service. How do I serve Jamaican British when knowing how to war is Jamaican British? So one of the things that kind of hold together this entire book, if I was to think of a poetic device, it's repetition. So almost all of the poems in some way, in the Perseverance, in some way you look at repetition, because repetition is so much a part of not only the learning experience as a teacher, but also the deaf experience as someone moving through the hearing world, and you're lip reading and you're always asking them to repeat, which is one of the reasons why there's so much repetition in the book. I'm gonna read a poem which I think talks to the dangers we are all in if we fail to understand each other. And this is a poem I wrote while I was in New York, and I was learning a bit of American Sign Language, and American Sign Language and British Sign Language, like spoken languages, they're different all over the world. So on this particular day, I decided to start trying to pick up some ASL, American Sign Language, and I learned the word alive. And in BSL, in British Sign Language, live or live is like this. You have to be careful with this sign, because if you do it quickly, that means toilet. So live, alive. But you know, if you're like, hey, I live, you could be, I'm toilet. Yeah, it's a tricky one. It's a tricky sign. So in American Sign Language, you say alive like this, alive, alive. And I came across this story about a man who got into a brutal situation with police, lost his life. His name is Daniel Harris. So this poem is called Two Guns in the Sky for Daniel Harris. When Daniel Harris stepped out of his car, the police officer was waiting, gun raised. I used the past tense, so this is irrelevant in Daniel's language, which is sign. Sign has no future or past tense, it is a present language. You are never more present than when a gun is pointed at you. What language says this if not sign? But the police officer saw hands waving in the air, fired, and Daniel dropped his hands, his chest bleeding out to the concrete meters from his home. And I'm in New York coffee house reading this news on my phone when a black policewoman walks in, 2 guns on her hips, my friend next to me reading the comment section, Black Lives Matter. Now what could we sign or say out loud when the last word I learned in American Sign Language was alive, alive, both thumbs pointing at your lower abdominal, index fingers pointing up like 2 guns in the sky. All right, cool. I'm gonna read talking about like repetition and how it gets used in different ways in another poem. This poem is called I Want the Confidence of. And I'm reading this because when I was writing this book, you know, there was like double the amount of poems I wrote compared to what ended up in the book. But the thing that kept coming up for me thinking about these poems emotionally was how low my self-esteem was growing up, and how I would just strive for this confidence, and I would be very impressed by people who had confidence. So this is a poem which patches together lots of different, I guess it's stories and examples of confidence and how that manifests itself to a younger version of me. And the first line is true about Salvador Dali. I want the confidence of Salvador Dali in a 1950s McDonald's advert, of red, gold, and green ties and shantytown dapper dandies, of Cuba Gooding Jr. in a strip club shouting, "Show me the money," of the woman on her phone in the quiet coach, of knowing you'll be seen and served, but no one will cross the road when they see you, the sun shining through the gaps in the buildings, a glass ceiling in a restaurant where knives and spoons wink, a polite pint and a cheeky cigarette, tattoos on the arms, trains that blur the whole city without delay. I want the confidence of a coffee bean in the body, a surface that doesn't need scratching. I want to be fluent in confidence so large it speaks from its own sky. At the airport, I want my confidence to board without investigations, to sit in foreign cafes without a silver spoon and a teacup clinking into sunken places, of someone named after a saint, of Matthew, the deaf footballer who couldn't hear to pass the ball but still ran the pitch, of leather jackets and the teeth of hot combs, rolling roadmen and rubber. I don't want my confidence to lie. It has to mean helium balloons in any shape or color, has to mean rubber tree in rain. Make it my sister leaving home for university, my finally sober father, my mother becoming a circus clown. There is such a thing as a key confidently cut that accepts the locks it doesn't fit. Call it a boy busking on the canal path, singing to no one but the bridges and the black water under them. I'm going to read one of the poems which I never read live. Thought this might be a good one to try out. It's inspired by a poet called Wayne Holloway Smith. And a poem of his called Love Minus Love, Love Minus. Check out Wayne Holloway Smith. His poetry is brilliant. He's got a pamphlet with Outspoken Press that's out at the moment, and I really enjoy his work. So I thank him for this poem, which is called Thinking of Dad's Dick. The way it slipped out his trousers like a horse's tongue, the way he'd shake it after pissing, how wide and long it was. I never thought I'd compete. Funny to thank him for this now, how he didn't really have secrets, was open about his 3 children with 3 different women, how he ran from them. He told me he'd had sex with 48 women in his life, said his first week in London, a woman sucked his dick on the top floor of a night bus. He never held back details. He knew he wouldn't live to see me grown. I know that now. He had to give while he could the length of his life to me. I'm going to read probably one more towards the end. This is a poem I wrote while I was caring for my dad. He had a range of medical issues, but he slowly developed dementia. So I got to kind of see him enter that new experience of life as someone with dementia. And there was a Derek Walcott, not even a poem, but a line from Derek Walcott I remember I was reading, and I remember underlining this line in it that said, "Black with widening amnesia." And I know amnesia and dementia are very different things, but still the idea of amnesia in a kind of, people talk about historical amnesia, cultural amnesia, and how that also relates to dementia, which is this medical thing. So it's also kind of play on medical and cultural language, which is also at work within this book. So dementia. When his sleeping face was a scrunched tissue wet with babbling, you came, unraveling a joy in him, making him euphoric, dribbling from his mouth. You simplified a complicated man, swallowed his past until your breath was warm as Caribbean concrete. Old tender syndrome, steady in his graying eye, fading song in his grand dance hall. If you must, do your gentle magic, but make me unafraid of what is disappearing. Yeah, good.
I'm just saying thank you so much, Raymond. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Fading song in his grand dance hall. I've always loved that line. It was interesting watching reading. It made me think, and I hope you won't take this in the wrong way, of those German football teams at the moment who are having to play their football games in these ghost stadiums.
Yeah.
Because of course poetry on so many levels relies on the audience, both the live audience
exactly.
and also the unseen audience, the reader who you will never meet. So, but it sort of begins in a similar space where you're reading now. It begins in that incredibly intimate space, that very individual space. And I read somewhere that you said that for a long time, poetry was an intensely private thing for you. But then you felt that you were very lucky to be nurtured by specifically the slam poetry communities, and not just here, but in Germany and the States. And I was just wondering if you could tell us something about what that transition from the private space and into a particularly public form of poetry, and what the transition into those communities, what you felt it did for your writing, or what it kind of gave you as a poet.
Yeah, that's a great loaded historical question, but I like it. I'll attempt to answer it. So yes, writing began, I think, for a lot of poets, a lot of writers begin their journey as very developing very private relationship with language, and whether they're writing in journals or they're writing poems or stories or whatever like that, it has to begin somewhere. And I think it was just this thing I did to cope and to help understand what it was I was thinking. I remember being a very kind of emotional and sensitive child who needed to find ways to manage himself. And I mean, this isn't language I was thinking of consciously. This is only looking back that I realized how necessary it was, to write. And I got an older sister, and we get on really well now. She's great. She's a journalist, film journalist. But growing up, we used to kind of clash a lot. And I remember when I was around, 6, 7, I remember after a particular fight, a particularly violent, dramatic fight, we had to be separated by our parents. And I went away into my room and I started writing these stories, and like short stories, and with like a series of them. And they were about horses and ponies. And the narrator in all of these stories was always a pony. And it was like the only pony in the world, and everyone else was a horse, right? So it was just this kind of, I suppose, again, looking back at it, a kind of persecution narrative, which I leaned on. But I did that privately. I did that just for myself, and once I left the room and I left that book just lying around. And a few days later, I remember my sister came up to me and she put her hand on my shoulder and she said, sorry. And it was the first time she'd ever said sorry to me before about anything. I mean, it wasn't until I went back into my room and saw that my book of horse pony adventures weren't where I left them. And I just kind of remember thinking, oh, she must have read that story and it must have prompted this apology. So with that, that's a kind of, it's not a literal story, it's a metaphorical story. And it's not like my big sister, da, da, da. it's like using this kind of poetic device, which helped frame some kind of, it's like conflict resolution, you know,
Mm-hmm.
And so because that moment, I never forgot it. I think that instilled in me a firm belief in the power of language, storytelling, communication. You know, I never forgot that. So I think going forwards, you know, because I had so many jobs before becoming a writer or poet, teacher full time. But even, you know, I worked as I was giving out flyers. I was a lifeguard. I was worked in like removals, delivery vans, like lots of physical labor stuff. But even anytime I could, I would like be writing on my breaks. But the other thing was that I would always lose those jobs because I didn't know how to assert my deafness. So people got very confused. They would hear me speak, or they might not notice my hearing aids or whatever. So they would speak to me the same way they would speak to a hearing person without acknowledging that there has to be some, you know, I have to see your face, I lip read, and all of these kind of things. But it was also my responsibility to assert that. And I think writing poetry publicly in which I was able to assert, I guess, the part of myself that was, you know, all of my different identities really, but like specifically be able to write a poem and put something in there that says I'm struggling, you know, I'm trying to communicate with people in my life and people that are around me, and how, again, once someone often would receive my work or my poetry, and they've learned something new, I guess, about me, and that became this kind of positive thing which would happen. You know, like, it's just those little things that I think gave me, I mean, talk about confidence, gave me confidence and gave me this kind of affirmation for not just like the value, well, yeah, actually the value for putting this in the world. And then meeting, you know, because it's so interesting, like I get messages from people about the perseverance, not just people who struggle with deafness, but also a lot of people who struggle with speech, people who have quite strong stutters, or people who maybe in school, they spent a lot of time in special educational units. So it was interesting how speaking about this one thing, of which is again about communication and struggling to communicate, kind of reaches wider than the prism of this one kind of category of deafness. But your other part of the question was about the wider community and how I slotted in and found that. So yeah, when I was about 19, I started doing slam poetry, and the first night, there was this night at the Radar Foyer Bar. I met a poet called Bogdan Piasecki, Deanna Roger, and a few others, but those were the two that Jazzman John. And I remember just kind of sat right at the front and watching them, and then I put my name down on this list to sign up for a slam. I had no idea what a slam was or what I was doing. I just wanted to be involved. And so I entered the slam. You had to have 3 poems to get to the final. So I got to the final. It was me and this other poet called Deanna Roger. And I came second. And Deanna, as a prize, it was Deanna's first slam as well. And she got to go to Paris. And I remember we stayed in touch. So she came back from Paris and told me, like, oh my God, this is amazing. Like, I just showed up, did the slam, and I've got this international experience. And me and Deanna, we both kind of from households, I don't know, like people would call them like working class households. And so we kind of recognize that in this space, in this like a slam poetry live performance space, there was such a range of voices, styles, because there were people coming to slam. I quickly realized, going to more slams, there were people coming from all these different genres, from theater, from comedy, from folk singing, from like storytelling. It just encompassed so much. It was just kind of I don't know, melting pot, which served as a catalyst. So I don't know, I was really moved and inspired by the inclusivity of it and the kind of people it drew. So again, like, that was something that kind of I kept doing, because it also prompted me to travel. I knew that whatever work I was going to end up doing, I knew I wanted to travel. I trained as a personal trainer for 3 years, and I had clients and stuff. And my dream at this point in my early 20s was to get a job as a personal trainer on a cruise ship, because then you could just travel the world in the cruise ships. But the more I learned about cruise ships, the more I was like, I don't want to be on a cruise ship, you know.
Especially now, it's really not a good look at
now.
the time of COVID-19. It's really not.
Oh my God.
It's interesting hearing you talk about that slam environment, of course. I mean, you know, part of the makeup of slam is that the immediate audience have a huge effect on whether you win or you don't.
Yeah.
As a poet, and I think I have actually read you, I think that you've written about this, or you've spoken about this in the past. Was there a point when you wanted to, what's the best way of putting this, to sort of to be as true as you can to the motivation of the poem, rather than going for what you know an audience would love, but in your mind might sort of compromise the poem? Because I mean, it's a tricky transition to make.
Yeah, it is a tricky transition to make, and it is one which is changed, you know. And that's why I always say that thing of every poem is its own energy, its own species, right? Something that works for one poem. I mean, even thinking of like poetry forms, like I can't tell you how many sestinas I've written, right? I mean, Owen, you must have done a hell of a load of, you know, like you try these things out, be it like a crown of sonnets, a sestina, a panto, whatever. And it's like what I've realized as as someone who's been writing a lot longer, with a lot more writing years behind me and reading years, is that you don't, I mean, in my experience, you can't really set out to write these things. You need to know of them and then find it within the poem, right? So it's just this kind of like,
it's interesting you should say that, you know, because you do, I mean, one of the things that you do in here is that you do also pull off those established forms incredibly well. You know, if you look at the title poem, The Perseverance. So are you saying that you didn't set out to write in a particular form in that instance, but when you gravitated towards the territory of that poem, which I'd like to talk about the title in a bit anyway, that the form felt sort of organically right? It felt true to that motivation?
Right, well, because I'd written so many sestinas before and failed, and you know, every poet will have a whole heap of failed sestinas. It's and a lot of people, they're kind of a marmite form, in that they are kind of a party trick as well. Like, hey, look at what I can do, this thing. But anyway, I do enjoy them. But with that particular poem, The Perseverance, that the first draft of that was not a sestina. I left it for a few days and came back to it, and then I saw naturally in that first draft, I was like, oh, look at these, I've used the same words, you know, about 15 times, you know. So I realized that those words were father, perseverance, basically. And then once I kind of worked that out, I then wrote the poem following the form, and it worked like that. It was like magic. It was like literally having a puzzle piece and just going,
wow. It's a fantastic example of a form strengthening something that is already inherent within the poem.
Right,
you know?
right. And the thing interesting, one of the things the form did for me, if you looked at the first draft into what it was that the whole poem in the first draft was just this one kind of scene, this idea, you know, some people talk about a definition of poetry is this kind of concentration of a moment or an idea, right? So it was just this one scene of my dad, but then it kind of, within the form, it naturally just had to move away from this scene where I'm actually outside the pub, and then I'm in the flat, you know, and then I was able to come back to, so it was like, it's kind of mysticism, you know what I mean? Like these poetry forms survive for a reason, you know, they're still with us, right? So learning that and realizing that was such a revelation, especially as someone who like I feel like I was very kind of defensive about, I suppose, institutional learning. I kind of wore this whole badge of honor thing that's like, well, you know, I'd never gone to university school at 16, I'd done all this work and blah, blah, blah. What can the institution teach me because of blah, blah, blah. But then actually, yeah, more, and you know, I went to Goldsmith University in the end, which was part of a kind of scholarship which I had to apply for, jumped all these hoops through, and it was so enriching for me because it gave me a place to, I guess, defend some of the ideas I had about poetry, about creativity, about art, about teaching, about education. You know, that kind of rigorous intellectual, I suppose, challenge ended up being really good, I think, for my thinking more than anything. As a teacher, again, the MA I did wasn't really in poetry, it was more in art therapy. It was more in looking at how self-expression and art saves lives, how it reduces stress and all this stuff. I know you know all about this.
Well, no. It's interesting that you should say that, you know, because when I introduced you, I called you a poet and an educator, a teacher, because I'm aware that you don't really make any distinction between those two terms.
No. Yeah.
And again, I read somewhere that you once said that creativity inspires new ways of understanding each other. I'm just wondering if you could just speak a bit more about that and about what you've found through experience and some of your thinking about the role of creativity in the classroom. Because obviously it's a move that we're starting to see, and I'm very proud to say that, you know, the new schools curriculum in Wales is so very much leading that charge, but we've still got a long way to go.
Yeah, for sure. I guess I'll give you a concrete example, which is in the book, which I can talk about. So there's a poem which I came across by a poet called Ted Hughes, who you all know, and I came across this poem by Ted Hughes called Deaf School, in which Ted Hughes writes, basically in the early 80s, he was commissioned by the National Theatre to, quote, examine how people live without language, how they exist without language. And Ted Hughes' understanding of that was just to think, well, who doesn't have language? Deaf people. So he went to a deaf school in London, and he sat in the corner and observed a deaf lesson taking place in a deaf school. And he wrote this poem in which, and some of the language he uses to describe the deaf students is quite unimaginative, to put it really lightly, but unaware, simple pools, lacking a dimension, removed from the vibration of air, alert, simple, lacking a subtle waving aura of sound and responses to sound. So with this poem, it angered me so much because, you know, I went to a deaf school and I just thought, wow, you know, that could have been me or any of my friends in that school, but like, and not having a clue how we're being read by this like grand poet. You know, he is like the walking, like the embodiment of like English literature greatness, and he comes in and pathologizes us with this assault in a way, you know. So the first draft that I wanted to do was I typed out the poem, looked at all the line lengths, and then I crossed the poem out. But then the Ted Hughes estate had a problem with that, and we're probably
I can't think why.
Yeah, it wasn't going to go down well. So I decided to completely like redact the poem so it looked like this on the page, right? So you've got the right. So I went into a deaf school a couple of years ago in Hertfordshire, a Knightsfield Deaf School, and I said shared this poem and this story with these deaf young people, and they just looked at me, just kind of like, wow, you know, you wear hearing aids, you went to a deaf school like us. Does this mean we can also be poets? It was a really beautiful experience. But I loved it, that moment of when I showed the class this. And there was one boy who put up his hand and said, "Sir, can you just turn the book around?" And I said, "What, like this?" And when he saw it like this, he said, "Oh, you know, that's like the audio channel on my audiologist and my doctor's screen when they put in my cochlear implants. so you can see.
What?
And when I saw that for me was that embodiment again of that value of creativity. It's creative thinking, it's lateral thinking that has brought this very physical, inspiring, transcendent experience with these 12-year-olds, into the world. And so that's just one of many examples, I think, of how creative thinking, non-literal thinking has its power. It's also interesting to me, I just realized that in BSL, this is how you say metaphor. So you're swapping one thing for the other, but also it's the same sign as empathy. Empathy and metaphor are the same sign. That's
extraordinary.
It's incredible, isn't it? So like even thinking of that.
Yeah. And then you won the Ted Hughes Award. Interesting.
Then I won, which I thought was a joke, but yeah.
It was not a joke. I'm keen now to move to some of the questions coming from the audience.
Okay.
And then I should say we are going to hear some more of Raymond's poems as well.
Yeah.
The first one that came in was from Andrew Green, and he says that, Raymond, you once quoted Michael Rosen's advice, "You're a poet, tell the truth." Truth is in short supply at the moment. Dominic Cummings. How should a poet's truth be made to count, do you think? And thanks for the brilliant poems. So how should a poet's truth be made to count?
Oh, I mean, my mind, when I hear that, runs over all of these like stock phrases of what people have said about poetry. So, the Shelley quote of poets are the unlegislated, leaders of the world, whatever. It's quite a grand question to ask. But the thing that you asked me about, Owen, like at the beginning of my career and beginning of like my writing and my thinking about writing and finding a value in it, which was personal, was I think of that time as almost solely being motivated by enthusiasm. And enthusiasm, again, is an interesting word to use because the root word of it, it's a Greek term, and it means responding to the God within you. And I love that kind of potential that enthusiasm has as a word, as a meaning, but also as a practice, as being guided by that. And when you look at particularly the classic poets, particularly like Rumi and Hafiz, even Neruda in places, these poets who transcend the language, the language that they wrote and spoke in, and have been like, even in translation, just worldwide, even Shakespeare. I think there's something magic about the enthusiastic kind of lover of life as person, because that's what they kind of were within their language, these kind of static, inspired, divine, conduits for language that just transcends. I believe personally in the power and value of that, because history shows us that. How do we, and that's the tricky thing, like you said about even within this Zoom call now with you, Owen, like, I don't know, you told me that there are about 100 people here watching, and like basically the impact that this direct discussion that's happening now is completely invisible to me. Right, I don't, and that's what it is, right? That's what writing is. You are it's a kind of faith that you have to have in yourself, but also in the power and the potential of your work to kind of go out into the world and move through the world as it needs. I think the fact that the poem I read, Jamaican British, is now, I know Owen as well has it's on the GCSE syllabus, like it's being taught, but the energy of it began in a classroom in which I was speaking to these students. So I feel like that is just one example of kind of honoring the energy of your creativity, of your ideas, and as it leaves you out into the world, hopefully it will find these connections with and between people.
Yeah, in that way, I guess you could say it's a it's a slower form of truth. You know, poetry might not be a truth that is particularly suited to the immediate comment, you know, the reportage.
Exactly.
But it's a slower form of truth, and then because of that, its legacy and its resonance can, at times, you know, be longer and deeper.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's dangerous too. You know, you know, I mean, of course, like, I don't deny that there are very enthusiastic fascists out there who are using their gifts. You know what I mean? It's still a gift.
Yep.
Like anything that kind of transcends the self and can create this. You know, unfortunately, like a lot of that kind of harnessing is one of anger. It's one of hate. It's a particular energy. And there's a lot of angry, hurt people out there, and that's kind of resonating with people, you know. So I get that, and that's a kind of truth. You can't deny that some of the terrible, hurtful lies that are spread by, you know, a lot of media. Like there's still a kind of truth in it, and you know what I'm saying. It's a murky, complicated thing. And the belief is, the hope is that the poets, kind of the visionary poets. I mean, even thinking about William Blake, an anarchist at time, a poet who was all about like anti-empire. He was all about, people in that sense. He, you know, he's got that vision in London, the blood running down the palace walls. You know, there's all these images that just a truth. It's truth. It's resonating. It's felt and seen and understood. I don't know if that's kind of a rambling way to talk about it. But
I mean, you know, we're talking about truth. We're talking about huge abstract nouns. I think that's probably the only way to address it, because, well, I suppose in that very comment, you put your finger on it. In that, one thing a poem hopefully can do is be that considered use of language. You know, all of us are going to ramble and roam when we answer these kind of questions as people, but in a poem, you can hopefully, you know, bring out the sharper scalpel edge of poetry. I'm going to move on to, there's been a few questions about signing and the use of your hands. Someone, forgive me if I don't find your name immediately, said that you obviously use your hands for both signing and for emphasis when you're reading. How important is it for you to perform your poetry than just to recite it? That was from Bernadette. And then kind of related, a question from Dominic about the use of repetition in the volume. And he's wondering how important is repetition in terms of sign poetry? Is the same image commonly repeated? Is that something that you've translated onto the page? So I guess your questions around how does your fluency in sign language relate to both your performance and your writing?
So I'm not a British Sign Language poet. That's a completely different skill. I've dabbled in it. I've watched in awe of people who are able to do it. Donna Williams, Carol Parker, Sophie Stone. There are numerous examples of deaf BSL poets who use sign for poetry, which I can give you a link to if you want to investigate that. But that it's its own kind of form. I realized that, you know, the written word, it has its own history, its own lineage, its own etymology. So a sign word is different, has a different history, a different shape, a different etymology. So one example of a way repetition is used in the sign. So you have all of the vowels on one hand, A, E, I, O, U, and you have certain poems where the repetition is just the hand shape or just a vowel. So it's like the beginning of each line has to begin with a hand shape or a vowel. You know, that's just an example. Again, I'm not an expert on it, but I work when I perform with an interpreter. One of them that I perform with, who is amazing, who's an absolute genius in my opinion, is called Anna Kitson. And so when I do live readings, I try to, you know, because she knows the book. We've spoken through how, you know, different versions of the poems in sign, me and Anna. So if you ever get to see me live, I'll probably be with Anna, and you'll get to see how many different versions of the Perseverance actually exist. So there's like an audio version, which is a different thing. The book version is its own thing. I mean, there's a live signed version, which is its own thing. So it's yeah, so it's yeah, I mean, I signed when I was at school, you know, so I learned at 11, but once I left school, I kind of lost touch with the deaf community, and I solely existed in the hearing world. And it wasn't until writing and thinking about my upbringing and my education that I realized how unique that texture, I suppose, of being young and deaf was, which I didn't really appreciate at the time. It was something I ran away from. And, you know, there was a point when I only wanted to associate with hearing people, because, you know, I don't know, I just didn't have the confidence to assert, or the kind of knowledge to know if I needed a kind of nurturing within both worlds, the deaf and the hearing world. But yeah, I'm no kind of spokesperson. And even now in quarantine, because I haven't seen anyone, like any language, I haven't been able to practice it or use it. So I'm kind of I'm out of tune with it almost. There was a part of the question there about volume. Volume is an interesting one, because volume is something I always try to bring within the work. I want it to bring to the page. I think when I was kind of reading a lot of English poetry, I remember that was something that I used to think. Where's the volume in this? Why is there this kind of assumed excellence that exists in the quietness and the subtle? And I just felt like, well, that's just one note to hit. You can hit others, but you shouldn't. I just disagreed with kind of shying away from the volume, from the noise within poems. And I guess because my dad was Jamaican, so he would play, you know, a lot of Jamaican music, and, you know, he would say that Bob Marley was a poet and a prophet. And then I got my mom on the other side saying, well, William Blake is a poet and prophet. So like I had these kind of models within my mind that I didn't have to kind of just be a quiet poet, which is just geared towards these subtle, small moments. Whereas you have like poets from Jamaica, like Linton Kwesi Johnson or Muta Baruka. My dad also loved Gil Scott-Heron. So there are all these musicians and poets who've also kind of, again, their poetic is volume, is noise. You know, it's also this kind of, a lot of it is like the self-affirmation of you know, the voices of the people. And I found that reading Pablo Neruda, you know, I found it in different places.
It's such an interesting idea of volume in poetry. I think you're quite right. It isn't something that is discussed enough, you know, how so many of us, and I count myself in this as well, you know, can fall towards what we think is the register of poetry, you know. It's interesting. You said that you were talking about the noise, and in one of your poems, you talk about how the sign language, the BSL sign for noise in London is the same. Is that right? So, which must have been interesting recently, sort of seeing London go so quiet. But I suppose that in a way leads me to a quick question about place. So the title poem is The Perseverance. Obviously that is multi-layered, but it's also a very specific pub in Hackney. And, you know, on first instance, I would say this is a collection of place, and it feels like a collection of place. But in my introduction, I said, actually, the poems are born in between all these places. Sort of, you know, moving between them and being caught between them. I just wondered if you had any thoughts yourself on how place has affected your poetry and perhaps how it's changed.
I realized I didn't read The Perseverance. I did say I would. So should I read the poem and then if we got time, is that all right?
That would be lovely. And then we can also hear how you and the Sestina Form finally got into bed together and made beautiful music.
But anyway, all right. So my dad's favorite singer was a man called Peter Tosh. He was one of the Wailers, and he's got a song called Mama Africa. And in that song, Peter Tosh has the line, "Love is the man overstanding And I got all of these memories of like my dad playing that song, and he would always, love is a man overstanding. He would say that, talking about volume, it's a word he would say loudly, a line he would say loudly. So yeah, the perseverance. And as you say, the perseverance is the name of a pub in Hackney. I wait outside the perseverance, just popping in here a minute. I'd heard him say it many times before, like all kids with a drinking father, watch him disappear into smoke and laughter. There is no such thing as too much laughter, my father says, drinking in the perseverance until everything disappears. I'm outside counting minutes, waiting for the man, my father, to finish his shot and take me home before it gets dark. We've been here before. No such thing as too much laughter, unless you're my mother without my father, working weekends while the perseverance spits him out for a minute. He gives me 50p to make me disappear. 50p in my hand, I disappear like a coin in a parking meter before the time runs out. How many minutes will I lose listening to the laughter spilling from the perseverance while strangers ask, where is your father? I stare at the doors and say, my father is working. Strangers who don't disappear, but hug me for my perseverance. Dad said, this will be the last time before, while the TV spilled canned laughter, us on the sofa in his council flat, knowing any minute the yams will boil, any minute I will eat again with my father who cooks and serves laughter, good as any Jamaican who disappeared from the island I tasted before, overstanding our heat and perseverance. I still hear popping in for a minute, see him disappear. We lose our fathers before we know it, and I'm still outside the perseverance, listening for the laughter. So like,
thank you again.
Thanks. Yeah.
And I'm not just saying this because I'm talking to you on Zoom, but that is, you know, that's a fantastic lesson in form. You know, that's Sestina, in that all the way through it's sensed. You know, it's not known and in your face. And in a way, I feel as though you've answered my questions about place with that one poem. So I'm going to move on to some of the other questions from some of the audience because it's only fair. So a question from Luann: what is the most difficult part of your artistic process? And maybe or not, this might relate. We've had 2 or 3 questions about how have you sort of overcome your obstacles. I mean, that's quite a general question, but perhaps if we could start with what's the most difficult part of your artistic process?
Oh, that's an incredible multifaceted question, isn't it? Difficult part, because again, going back to even talking about poetry, every poem has its own needs, and you go on your own journey with an individual poem. And then once you have enough poems, and someone, in my case, someone just came along and said, I think you've written a book. And then was like, oh really? He's like, well, show me. It's like, well, if you put this here and this here and this here and this here, there's your book. I was like, oh right, oh wow, yes, I guess it's a book. So I have realized the power of having second opinions. I think that's one thing. Like when I was in the slam world and I was just doing live performances, I never had any kind of, I never got any feedback. I was just writing, and then I would go on the stage and I would just deliver these poems. When I started kind of, I guess when I got to university, one of the first critic, the first person to look at my poems was Jack Underwood. At Goldsmith University, Jack Underwood, who I just assumed would absolutely despise me and my poems and everything I stand for, because he's quite an outspoken person. But it's still, he's a brilliant poet and a brilliant mind, an amazing teacher and editor. And I remember he just looked at my poems and just, he just said, well, yeah, you know what, the poems here, he didn't even add anything. He just took things out. And it was like, oh wow, yeah, this is singing in a different way. And I remember just feeling inspired by that and realizing that the editing is its own skill. It's a different kind of thinking, isn't it? And whereas in the performance, I relied solely on the responses from a live audience to tell me whether or not, and I remember being in the middle of new poems and being like, oh, this is not working. The audience are just not with me, but then even that interesting place of being then on poems which I thought were really good, and I liked the way that they worked on the page, and when I read them out loud and they just didn't connect, and I still was like, I still kind of had some kind of allegiance to them. I was like, no, this is a good poem, I just shouldn't read it out loud. You know, that's what I mean. It's a murky thing. Like every poem is different. So the difficulties are always different. What I do now is that I do like to reach out. I do like to send poems to people, people who I think have wrestled with similar things or answering similar questions within their own work, and be like, hey, you know, I feel fortunate to have a couple people that I can do that with now.
And do you find that in some ways, I mean, you know, obviously at the start I was talking about all of the fantastic awards that you've won, but do you find that kind of a recognition, that kind of, you know, it's the equivalent of the slam audience on a national and international scale? Cool. So now, you know, sort of, all right, you know, everyone's liked this. The audience have liked these ones. To then sit down at the desk. I mean, I know that you joked, you're saying, you know, you're only as good as your last poet, but I'm sure that, you know, I know that every writer finds this. The more experienced you become as a writer, also the more conscious you are when you sit down at the desk. So has that become something of a challenge?
Honestly, I write in such a manic, sporadic way that no, I'm still writing, I'm still going for it. And the noise of acclaim doesn't get into me when I'm at the page, if I'm honest. That comes later. That comes probably when I've submitted a poem to a magazine or something. And it's like, what happened actually was in that year is I wrote so much, like, as you know, when I was getting these emails of being shortlisted for this stuff, I was like, oh my God, because I became convinced, utterly convinced that I couldn't write anymore. And so I was just writing loads of poems, absolutely manically, to prove to myself I could still do this, and that if I was to win these awards, that I wouldn't be a fraud. So it's not like I've done, all right, goodbye. So I've written all of these poems, which, and you know, I've got like a project that's kind of simmering now, like a collection of poems, and it's very different. It's very different to these poems. You know, I think it's still, and I have no idea how people are going to relate to it. I don't know, relate to it or resonate with it. I have no idea. They might hate it. But the thing is, again, I'm trying to serve the energy, the idea, the thing that pulled me down to write them. I'm trying to protect that as much as I can. But you're right, it does get difficult. I mean, you're a poet of stature and awards. Is that also something that comes into your space? Like,
I think at times it has been, and well, or what I find, it's, you know, it's that constant dialogue between the subconscious and the conscious.
Yeah. And
so when I sit down at the desk, yes, I want to have benefited from all of the mistakes I've made in the past, and I want to know, you know,
so
I want to like not make them again.
Yeah.
But I also want to forget everything, and basically write from exactly where you've just spoken about, to protect that space and to be true to the motivation of why you want to write. You know, because we know that at the end of the day, the poems that are going to live and that will resonate, they are going to come from that space.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a tricky one.
Unfortunately, I think we're going to have to be calling time on this relatively soon. So I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping now. Might take one more quick question from the audience. If anyone's got anything burning, ask it now. And then we are going to finish with a poem, which I think is the only right way to finish these kind of things. So on the housekeeping front, I would just like to first of all thank Raymond for joining us. I'd like to thank all of you out there in all your private places. I'd like to thank Matt and Elaine of the Cultural Institute for making this happen. Our fantastic local independent bookseller in Swansea, cover to cover. I think that's most of the housekeeping. I'll just have a quick check of some of the other questions coming in now. People are also saying some very nice things.
Cool.
A question actually that's come in on the Q&A here about voice. How did you find your voice? I mean, voice is, you know, it's fantastically elastic and slippery term. So maybe to make that a little more specific, how did you find your voice in relation to the poets who were really speaking to you, to the poets where you found that volume? It can be so hard, can't it, to then to try not to emulate those that you love.
Yeah, I mean, the voice is always a question. It's another Marmite question, isn't it? Because that whole idea of finding a voice, anyone who says like, "Oh, I found my voice," sounds like you're saying, "I found my cubicle." I found my cubicle and I'm staying in it, not moving. It's my cubicle, and only I can exist in this. You know what I mean? It sounds so narrow. And again, like I keep saying this, like poems are different, right? Yeah. So every poem has its own kind of voice. However, I will say that, you know, within one of the things I've been doing in lockdown is that I've been having like focused readings of just one poet, like just reading as much as like the collected volumes. And I've been going through, I guess, you know, I guess I've been going through some of like the Faber classic poets. I've been reading Seamus Heaney and Derek Walcott and Anne Sexton, controversially, or I mean, all of them are very controversial, but like, and I can definitely say that from their early collections to their last, there is a consistency in it's in their no, it's not tone. It is like, this could only have been written by Derek Walcott or Seamus Heaney or Anne Sexton, you know. So it's not that the voice question is redundant. It's that I can't, as a poet, as someone freaking about in regards to my own work, I can't, if I try to be authentic, or I try to be my voice or whatever, you can feel and that the effort, you know, there's certain poems where you can be really off-put by the feeling, like I can feel someone has tried really hard to do this thing. And the whole thing about, you know, about art in general, about anything, people that are always working at the top of their game, there's often a fluid effortlessness within it. It has to be effortless. I mean, like, you know, I believe that.
Seamus Heaney has this. Seamus Heaney has this great line. I think it's in one of his poems where he says, "Don't have the veins bulging in the biro." Really? Which is just great, isn't it? And, you know, which kind of puts its finger on what you were talking there, when you can feel the effort. And you're right, perhaps, you know, personal rhythm is very close to the voice, you know, something that can be very different registers and tones and subjects, but is that poet's. And maybe the best answer to all of these questions are the poems themselves. So I think we are slightly over time, so we are going to bring it to a close, I'm afraid. But thank you so much. Diolch o galon, as we'd say in Wales. Thank you from the heart. Hopefully one day you can come physically to Swansea. Yeah. The beach is looking wonderful at the moment. You'd love that. But until then, this has been great. And to everyone out there, if you haven't read The Perseverance yet, please do. In one of Raymond's poems, the final line, it's the poem with the conversation with the art teacher, is how will someone reading this see my feeling? And I think it's a great way to describe this book. It's never sentimental, it's never overly emotive, but you read this and you see the feeling, you hear the feeling in every poem. So thank you, everyone. But we are going to go out, as we should, on the words of a poem. Thanks, Raymond.
Thank you, Owen. I really appreciate this and your kind words at a time where, you know, if I'm honest, like day to day, mentally has been a real, you know, as for a lot of people, you have kids, man. I don't have kids and I'm struggling. So you're doing something amazing.
In some ways, they help. I think, you know, when you're just trying to get the painted handprints off the wall, the mind is allowed to escape from all the other stuff.
Okay, great. No, I mean, talking about kids, I guess this is where we're ending it. So I suppose the question in this poem, it's the last poem in the books, Happy Birthday Moon, and it's a pantoum, so it uses the repetition, but also it's a poem which explores, like, the root question of it is, for me, like, this personal question of where does language begin? And when I wonder about where language began, and in this kind of personal and divine place it's being read to as a child. And there's this children's picture book. I'm very enthusiastic about children's picture books. I have one coming out, should have been out this year, but it's coming out next year now, which is also loosely inspired by this poem and this picture book. So my dad used to hold me on his chest, and he would have the book out in front of him like this, and he would like run his fingers along the words, and we'd see the pictures. And my dad is doing this not knowing that I'm deaf, but he had a very deep voice, and I remember feeling his chest vibrating against my back as I lay on it. And that was a kind of important kind of moment for me, because again it connected the volume, what you see and what you feel, right? In this story, Happy Birthday Moon, in case you haven't seen it or read it, it tells the story about a bear who's out in the woods one day, climbs the highest mountain, looks out over the valleys, over the rivers and the forests, looks up at the moon and says, "It's my birthday." And the bear's voice echoes across the valley and comes back, and he hears it again. "It's my birthday." And the bear says, "Wow, it's the moon's birthday too." So there's this device that happens in this book, which is genius. It's this repetition where you had to say everything twice. And sometimes my dad would go point to the empty blank page, and he would keep moving his finger along it as if there were words there. So he would also make up his own version every night, which I remember he did without ever telling me that's what he was doing. I got all the way into adulthood before I realized that he must have been having a laugh. You know what I mean? Anyway, the poem, Happy Birthday Moon. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening. I hope you're safe, hope you're well. Yeah, this has been a joy. Dad reads aloud. I follow his finger across the page. Sometimes his finger moves past words, tracing white space. He makes the moon say something new every night to his deaf son who slurs his speech. Sometimes his finger moves past words, tracing white space. Tonight he gives the moon my name, but I can't say it. His deaf son who slurs his speech. Dad taps the page, says, "Try again." Tonight he gives the moon my name, but I can't say it. I say, "Raymond Antrobus." He laughs. Dad taps the page, says, "Try again." But I like making him laugh. I say my mistake again. I say, "Raymond Antrobus." He laughs, says, "Raymond, there's something else." I like making him laugh. I say my mistake again. Raymond Antrobus. What else will help us? He says, "Raymond, there's something else. I'd like to be the moon, the bear, even the rain." Raymond Antrobus. What else will help us hear each other, really hear each other? I'd like to be the moon, the bear, even the rain. Dad makes the moon say something new every night, and we hear each other, really hear each other. As Dad reads aloud, I follow his finger across the page.
Thank you. Stay well. Hope to see you soon.
See you
Bye,
soon.
everyone.
See you.